Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I am doing well.
All right.
And ready and raring to go on solving the problems of the world.
All right.
But I don't know whether anybody's listening.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, when something comes up after we have a program, we kid about it and we say, oh, maybe somebody's listening. But I really am not going to believe that.
Well, the NSA is always listening.
But I do believe ideas have consequences.
That's true.
And the other thing is if it depended on who gets credit, that's a different story too. So somebody who's interested in ideas, if they seem to be getting out there, worrying about who gets credit is not very important, just so the ideas change. And you know, this is so true. Ideas come back to me, and I thought, well, you know, that's something I said 3 days ago.
Yeah.
Then I think, but it is true. But we want to talk about something today we've talked about before, and that's the military-industrial complex and how people make a lot of money off war, the war profiteers selling weapons. And most of the time, people don't want to say that's a policy. You know, it's just inevitable. We're good at building weapons, and they need to make a living too. And it's one of those things that we have lived with. And but right now, Trump is going to change policies. In February, he's going to change policy where it won't be so subtle. It'll be out in the open. I guess he gets a point for being more in the open, but it's a blatant support for the weapons industry to sell more weapons. Daniel, isn't it true that we already sell more weapons than anybody else? So it looks like they want to give a boost. Now, this was brought to our attention today on an article on Zero Hedge. And let me just read that headline. It says, U.S. Embassy staff to becomes arms salesman as Trump loosens weapons export policy. That sounds like corporatism. That sounds like crony capitalism. Couldn't be. Must be something else. What am I missing here?
Well, he's expected to issue, and you know, this may not be exactly as reported, but he's expected to issue in February a new national security decision directive, which will do a couple of things. First of all, it will ease the rules and regulations for the export of U.S. Military hardware. So it'll make it easier to export this stuff. But it also will engage the U.S. Embassy personnel and direct them to more specifically become more active in selling U.S. weapons, selling what supposedly are private companies' products to foreign governments overseas.
Well, it seems to me like there are better things to be concerned about other than building the profits of the arms manufacturer. It's not like there's a world war going on. There's a world effort going on to control the world, but it's not quite like World War II, where we have to distribute weapons, or we ended up doing it. But right now, I think it's strictly a money thing. You know, it seems like we have enough weapons. People say, well, even Trump's position has been we had to rebuild and redo and improve our nuclear arsenal. You know, how many do we need? You know, this sort of thing. So these sales are going to be turned over to people to promote in the embassies. And they are there. You know, I told you a story once about a distant relative worked in the State Department. He was working in an embassy, and he told me, sort of on the QT, he said, you know, there's CIA agents all over the place. I said, what are they doing, you know, spying on the enemy? He says, well, they do that, but what they do is really work for corporations. And this is 25 years ago, so it's been going on for a long time. There's nothing new about it. So war profiteering is a big deal. And I think our companies are making a lot of money. There's some people who write newsletters just to say, buy these stocks. And if you had been doing this, even under Obama, you know, this is just not a Trump position. He's sort of, you know, putting it out in the open. But arms sales went up under Obama. He was sort of in bed with the arms manufacturers too.
Yeah, and the top 5 defense contractors have seen their stock at record levels now, probably partially, at least, on the announcement that they're going to gain a huge sales force. You know, all the embassy personnel overseas are going to act as their salespeople, paid by us, of course, so they get to privatize the profits while socializing the costs. But in fiscal 2017, U.S. arms sales overseas was $42 billion. That's a pretty big industry. That was up from 2016 at $31 billion. So clearly it is increasing. We sell more weapons than any of the rest of the world. And these loosening of rules and encouraging embassy personnel to help sell U.S. weapons really is, as you say, a form of corporatism. And as we say on the show very often, Middle America should understand that this has nothing to do with your security.
Yeah,
this has to do with very well provided for elites in the Beltway.
And indirectly, there's a cost to the American taxpayers because there are subsidies, and this also expands the type of weapons. Sort of, it used to be just the big airplanes or something, but no, I think it includes a lot more weapons. So the smaller industries may get involved, but they have encouraged this, and unfortunately, the American people. Taxpayers pay something for this because there is a subsidy, and it's called the Export-Import Bank, and this is a subsidy to the corporations that you support the exports, and that is controversial. When I was in Congress, I tried to get rid of that, but of course that is protected. One time there was a major vote there, and our side wanted to cut it way down or get rid of it, won. But they said, well, we have to reverse this, which they did in 24 hours. And guess who reversed it? A bipartisan group of people, the big corporations along with the labor unions, and they wages higher than they normally would be. And they came together and they had a new vote. 100 people changed their vote. Imagine, just for these subsidies that go to big corporations. But this looks huge. But I think the big thing is it's out in the open. It used to be that we would sort of throw in the military-industrial complex as part of the deep state, and they were behind the scenes. They were doing something all the time to enhance their sales, even provoke confrontation, military confrontations. Maybe not the war itself, but confrontation, because that was good to prevent war and build more industries. But now it looks like the deep state, the military-industrial complex, they're moving into the swamp. The swamp is getting bigger if this goes through, which it will. This is going to go through. There's so much support for that, but it's going to be more shenanigans to protect big corporations, and it won't be just Republicans. It'll be Democrats just like the Republicans, and some will see this as wonderful. People don't realize that this big argument, in Washington about, if we have a conservative Republican, get rid of that liberal socialist Democrat, everything will do better. Then you realize, well, maybe that liberal socialist was sort of closer to the Republican Party and was a warmonger too, and selling weapons. And I think that's what's happening. I think that makes this problem worse because it makes it look like conventional status quo. It's all right. It's law. And I've worked on this idea at one time and still hold to it, and that is that weapons sales, when a company has, say, a jet fighter, of course, there are some regulations, but really all the technology that is ever sold that these companies have has been developed by the taxpayer. So it should be protected. It isn't like the free market. It's not anti-free market because you say, hey, look, you have this technology for this airplane and you're not to sell it, and the American taxpayer ought to be protected. But the American taxpayer isn't being protected. It looks like, jobs and profits are more important.
Yeah, they get to offload all the costs onto us, and then they get to reap the profits.
Right.
And you may have seen this, Dr. Paul. I saw it yesterday, and I may have it slightly wrong, but I saw a headline that said something like U.S. household incomes are frozen at 1989 levels. Did you see something like that? And I'm thinking about what we're talking about here. Well, this explains why, This is what's happening to middle America. This is why your wages are not getting better. It's because the corporate welfare bums have come in. They've sold this phony idea that the world is ready to attack us. We've got to sell arms. We've got to, buy more arms. And it's a complete scam, and it's destroying the country. Yeah,
and that is true. It got worse after '89, but it actually started down where real wages quit going up in 1971 because they were able to inflate the currency, and it would go into an arms industry and fighting wars and all these kind of things, and they were able to transfer the wealth, and that's why there's a disconnect today with the stock market being high and all the statistics wonderful. Well, why isn't there a euphoria media in the country today with concern for the lower half. The lower half, most of the time, they're not even counted anymore. You know, if you're in the labor participation rate is still very high, so they don't count people like that. So it's a gimmick they have, and I think the point that this whole process contributes to this distortion in real wages.
So we've looked at the economic aspect of corporatism. We've looked a little bit at the moral component of robbing middle America to pay for the corporate elites. But I think there's another aspect to this loosening of arms sales and encouraging embassy to sell, and that's the issue of U.S. national security. When we talk about national security, we should talk about it. Remember, there was we did a show on this a few months ago, or a couple months ago. There was a report from the Conflict Armament Research Organization. They had people on the ground in the Middle East, and they were just simply tracing where the weapons that were in ISIS hands, in Al-Qaeda's hands, where did these come from? They traced them back very meticulously. They found that even as early as 2013 and 2014, much of ISIS's advanced weapons and small arms were sourced from the U.S. They also found that these supplies, when the CIA gave weapons to moderates in places like Syria, it took about 2 months for them to finally end up in the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So all these wonderful weapons we're selling overseas will one day be used against American military, even against Americans overseas.
Yeah, and that's generally been true for a long period of time. That has happened, especially since the end of World War II, and all this stuff we've been doing in the Middle East. It's been getting into the wrong hands. And you know, back to the Export-Import Bank, they're reestablishing it and putting new members on right now. And our friend Scott Garrett from New Jersey, who's not in Congress right now, and who was a very good member of the banking committee and took some very good stands. Yeah. And he was up, I don't know whether it was for the chairman or just a member, but they had a vote in the Senate committee, and he was voted down significantly. And they said, "You're not even, you're not a super supporter of this Export-Import Bank." He said, "No, I'm not." So that was ending it. Because they're sort of looking, they have to have friends at the Export-Import Bank now so that loans are, generous, because that's where the discount comes from. You have to compete with the other countries, because they might undersell us. And there are some. Russia sells weapons, China sells weapons, Israel sells weapons, but we have to be the top dog. And I'd like to be top dog in a lot of things, like protecting civil liberties, but not in this. In this effort. So they do introduce this whole idea of distribution of these sales by human rights. Okay, as long as you don't violate anybody's human rights and they all have a fair shake in the courts, then we'll sell you weapons. But the human rights of selling weapons to people who kill each other, like in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, that's not a human right. That has nothing to do with it. And then I say, why don't they be concerned about the taxpayers and the civil liberties of everybody in this country? Then they might have something to say, even though they shouldn't interfere.
Our human rights. Here's what I'm wondering too, though. Trump has really overtly, and I would say probably foolishly, tied his presidency to the current success of the stock market. See, I came into power. Look how things are roaring. It's all because of me. That seems like a dangerous thing. But I wonder, since one of the only things that we seem to manufacture and export anymore are military weapons, I wonder how this might be tied to this precarious position that he's put himself in.
They have a secret, and they've already used it. Other countries have been using it, and that is the central bank buys up stocks. If there is a crash, they're going to buy them. They're very much involved in it. They've been involved with gold markets and all these things. This is my belief. And right now, there's a Swiss national bank. He has a huge investment in our stock market. Well, where did they get the money? Our Federal Reserve probably made sure they had the credit. So there will be the attempt. I think your concerns are justified, and there's a limit, because if they overdo it, then it just crashes the system and it'll crash the dollar. But there will be a change in the stock market, and they won't be able to hold it together by just the creation of new money. They did get away with it with QEs. They really pumped into the trillions of dollars, But ultimately, confidence will be lost, and I keep seeing, cracks in the seams of this confidence level. And one of these days, even the military stocks will probably go down, and it won't be good news for Trump.
Exactly, and I would just close by saying, as I write a weekly letter to our subscribers, and I would encourage anyone to subscribe. The Ron Paul Institute updates, ronpaulinstitute.org. You can just hit subscribe. But what I pointed out is that the military-industrial complex gets an enormous amount of money, obviously from us, as we talked about today, but they also put a good deal of money into think tanks. And that's very important because think tanks churn out expert papers telling us about threats, telling us about where we need to export our weapons, where we need to export our military. And so there's this kind of unholy alliance that perpetuates our perpetual war footing. And they're a key component in this, the think tanks, the military-industrial complex, the congressional complex, and all of these are tied together. So we have to expose it and try to break the chain.
Wonderful. And we must think once again about what our goals should be. And our president talks a lot about making America great again. I don't know and why that's been popular. Who wants to make America ungreat? But you have to define greatness, and I have a different definition. And it looks like right now, what's going on now is keeping America the greatest arms merchant in the world forever. And there'll be limits to it. And of course, we are the biggest arms merchant, and there's a lot of profits made, and there's a lot of justification. Always national security, increase the expenditures, build more nuclear weapons, more controls, and that is, to me, not Americans' greatness. If we were truly a great nation, what we would be doing is exporting ideas, the ideas of liberty, to show that people who understand what liberty is all about and understanding how we should trade and work with people, how that is the road to peace and prosperity, not enhancing and subsidizing the arms merchants. That is not the way to go. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.